Here we go, people. Another update, all based on the original article there. Last week's presentation is on YouTube there. There's quite a lot this week. The good, the bad, the not at all, and the backlash. A lot of backlash, unfortunately. Okay, if you want the slides are normally collected a day or two afterwards. But if you want any particular links or slides, do email me on chair RDRF, that's CHAIRRDRF@AOL.com. Okay, now, significant piece in the Times on 4th of July. This is by Emma Duncan, who's editor of The Economist, which I think you could say is sort of centre-right publication, not at all radical. And she's also making it clear that she's a bit of a car freak, that my car is also not just useful, it's exhilarating, it's fun, etc., but we have to take back our streets. So getting someone like that to say that low traffic neighborhoods are good is a very valuable and important thing to do. You know, people in our own bubble know that, but getting someone mainstream to say it is pretty important. Now, social media, of course, is very important. I don't know if you saw this when I recorded it a few days ago. It had 1.2 million views. And essentially, it's a black lad who's on his bike, nipping on and off the pavement, and he's stopped by the police while he's recording them. And he records this officer, not Ms. Happy, and she certainly won't be happy after she gets the various messages down the line from senior officers, where she tells him, where's your helmet, your high-vis, and your number plates? And so a lot of suggestions that obviously this is wouldn't have happened to a white kid on a bike, so it's racist, but it's also indicative of some officers' attitudes towards bicycling in particular. And the point I'm making is that stuff that goes out on social media can be seen by an awful lot of people. There's loads of stuff, loads of images, videos coming from Paris. I took this one from Ben Coates, counted up people in both directions in 25 seconds. I had 34 standard bikes, 9 hire bikes, and 5 e-scooters. There's lots of stuff coming from Paris like that if you want to get inspiration. Okay, now some stats from Sam Manga. Now this is using Department for Transport statistics on cycling, which are always something to be treated with caution. Plus you'll see that this curve in green has been his effort at making sense of all these green dots all over here. So we could call that a lot of fluidity, to put it mildly. And what it says is that discounting weekends, bank holidays, we have about a 70 to 80% increase in cycling in June. That's around here, around 170. It's not 170%, 100 is the baseline, and this is with less commuting. Now remember, the weather was unusually good in April and May. My view is that this increase could all change when lockdown ends, unless there are big measures to cut car use and support cycling. Because don't forget, a lot of cycling commuters may end up home working or driving. But that's some interesting background stats. Now, general news, bit of good news. Part 6 of the Traffic Management Act 2004 was activated by the Minister. And that relates to moving traffic offences, and it's outside London. And someone like Mark, if Mark is on board, or Phil, can explain to you exactly what that means. That's what the red asterisk means. So that's a bit of good official news. The rest of it is still delay. The updated National Cycling and Walking Plan was due for June. The minister responded to Fleur, what's her name? Fleur Anderson, I think, the minister for the member for Putney, saying this summer. The inspectorate we were promised, haven't heard anything more of that. The active travel commissioner in charge of it, again, we haven't heard anything about it. And the update of local traffic note 2008, again, that's this summer. So delay, delay, delay. The voucher scheme was due to start by the end of June. I haven't seen that coming through yet. And that leads to this tag has been put on people's Twitter addresses, sort of broken up E, and it's to do with Edinburgh, which has not been delivering as much as we'd hoped, end of and enough. A lot of people getting annoyed at stuff not going in as soon as it could. This is from Leith. Don't forget, I don't know how long these things have been in for, how long they're going to be in for, whether they've changed since the photograph was put on social media. I'm just reporting stuff that comes out on social media. And that's, you know, the kind of thing that invites comments like slaloming around the lamp posts and hitting the signs and so on. And there is a lot of bad stuff up there, so I will be reporting on some of it. Okay, now the first tranche was announced. That's the link if you want to look at it in detail. Emergency Active Travel Fund, final and indicative allocations. Indicative is for the next tranche. Okay, so this is those getting less than 100%. Now, you can see, for example, Essex 50%, Surrey 50%, right at the bottom, Bedford, Blackpool, Rutland have been getting just 25%. I'll be saying a bit more about Oxfordshire, who bid for 597, got 298, they're 50%. Cycling UK has identified 23 councils which they said receive more than the 20%, that's 20% extra, should really be 120%, but I'm quoting them. Some people got 120%, indicating highly ambitious plans to enable more active travel, and 33 received the full amount. You can read that in the Cycling UK release. So what happened in Oxfordshire? Well, they got the 298,500, and opposition Lib Dem councillor tweeted, letter from the Department for Transport confirms that they didn't receive the full allocation of active travel funding because they didn't follow the simple instructions they were given. So here's the letter, and I've put in red the original quotes which you've seen from previous presentations from me. They state that to receive any money under this or future tranches, you will need to show us that you have swift and meaningful plans to reallocate road space to cyclists and pedestrians, and that anything that does not meaningfully alter the status quo. First thing is walk and cycle improvements. That looks good. 2.7 kilometre path. Station to dockyard walking and cycling route looks quite good. Walking and cycling facilities linking a park and ride with a new development. City centre walking and cycling links. But, you know, that could be radically transformative, but it could be, there's a lot of bus and hubs and electric this and electric that. So for 51 million quid, maybe it's not that impressive for active travel. But, you know, you need a local to tell you what's actually going to be happening. I mean, the new development here, don't know how many houses or shops, don't know how good the facilities are going to be. It could be good, we don't know. Okay, now, Glasgow and Edinburgh, less to pay for the bike hire. you know, the headline in local transport today was free bike hire, but it's not actually that free. It's just less to pay, and it's 1,300 bikes in 2 cities. How much of an impact is that going to make? I don't know. West Midlands got 400k more than they bid for. Bedford got only 25% of the initial tranche. And the problem there is a problem of footway extensions, which has been highlighted. Sometimes those footway extensions just mean you have to take the lane. There's nothing there for cyclists. And are the footway extensions that good anyway? Do pedestrians use them? Are they actually genuinely helpful? Glasgow on London Road. This line is going to have wands on it or cylinders, but problem of, guess what, the lane disappearing at junctions. Now some good news. This was North Tyneside, 3 miles along the seafront, very well received. Lots of pictures of kiddies cycling up and along there. It looks nice, but some of the people who put it in have had to start up a petition to make it permanent. They want it to carry on. They're worried it might be opposed effectively. And one of the people supporting it was told that she would burn in hell because the scheme was so diabolical. So, you know, there's always a loony around. In fact, there are actually often quite a lot more than just 1 or 2 loonies. Sheffield, that looks pretty impassive, although I've heard that Liberal Democrat opposition leader has been opposed to measures like that because he saw an ambulance using the temporary cycle lane to actually get past a row of cars that had blocked the road. And it would seem to me that that's actually a reason to support the cycle lane, because it's actually a facility for emergency vehicles. Okay, Dudley. Now, this is the kind of flushed footway and carriageway where a footway extension should be useful. However, you can't see, maybe there's just one little opening. There's no ability of pedestrians to actually cross the road. Plus, it's a bit more inconvenient for motorists, and it wouldn't surprise me if some cyclists are using this as an advisory cycle lane. So the estimable Phil says, why not just pedestrianize it? Leicester. Okay, that's a nice message. No going back. Yes. That's interesting because it's a temporary pop-up cycle lane on the inside of parked vehicles. That's very interesting. And this is rather sweet. Pizza place saying, please do not park in the cycle lane. We will not serve pizza or accept deliveries from anyone parking in the cycle lane. Yeah, bit of nice messaging. Now, 2 other things. Beaumont Lees Lane. I've seen a more recent photograph of this, but here you've got the cylinders and you've got parking on the footway, and presumably locals are driving in through the cylinders to park there. And maybe that's the reason for these cones. I don't know, but the cones do seem to narrow the cycle lane. Here's an alfresco dining space on the Golden Mile. Various bits and pieces about more space for dining coming out this week. Okay, now some backlash stuff. Kent U-turn on motor traffic closure of 4 roads in Sandwich. That's not good. Tower Hamlets, some planters which were put in right at the beginning and signs were taken away. They've now apparently been put back. There's a long story about how it's causing extra traffic to go through a neighborhood that had been planned for a low traffic neighborhood, but it's now going to be done differently and it's going to be consulted on. It's a long complicated story, but it's an example of some planters being moved and signs taken away, which we'd seen a few weeks ago in Hounslow. Also in Lambeth, something quite interesting happened here. Now, you remember one of the first footway extensions was under this bridge at Herne Hill. And one day last week, some eagle-eyed activists noticed that these barriers have been put back on the footway. So they contacted the council and said, why have you done this? The council said, we haven't done it. It's been done illegally. So they've now been put back. You can see where they were. So, you know, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. You have to keep an eye out for that. In Leicester, some cones have been knocked down either by cars or on purpose. We don't know. I've heard that in Ealing, some of the cylinders have been bashed. So, you know, bad stuff is happening there, either accidentally or otherwise. Now, I don't know if you know Bez, Beyond the Curb. He produced, he's still around, he produced a t-shirt which was ride a bicycle and upset the idiots. So here they are. He is the council leader of Walsall, the one council in West Midlands Combined Authority isn't doing anything. He's argued that installing pop-up cycle lanes would present an insurmountable challenge. And this is due to the dangers of mixing cars and bicycles. Actually, the cycle lanes are to not mix cars and bicycles, but never mind. I find at this point in time now, because there are less cars on the road, cyclists are taking ownership of the road. We wish. With the pop-up lanes, cars would be mingling with riders on a regular basis. We are told we need to give cyclists more distance when overtaking. Suddenly at this point, I see cyclists riding 2, 3, or 4 abreast. You don't actually, that's just photographs taken funnily and you making it up in the road. It makes it extra dangerous for cars to pass. So don't pass them, you idiot. And Reigate, yes, the Crispin has been well publicised. Crispin Blunt MP was appalled at the predicted traffic chaos in Reigate. Haven't actually seen that. Businesses complained and the pop-up cycle lanes were pulled on the 5th. So there's a bit of backlash. Now, a bit of ultra backlash against a low traffic neighbourhood in Ealing. Now, you may have seen this on the news. This is on my old patch, West Ealing. A tree which had some problems with its roots, very shallow roots, just fell over and was recorded on a dashboard. So it's nothing to do with anything the council done or low traffic neighbourhoods or anything. But the MP, Rupa Huck, sister of Connie Huck, incidentally, if you may remember from Blue Peter, and someone who I'd communicated with when she wanted some cycle parking at home when I worked at Ealing. And she put this up saying, scary incident in South Ealing, luckily everyone unscathed. Makes this proposed madcap scheme, that's the low traffic neighbourhood, that will gridlock the hood, notice the hood, you know, pretty edgy wording there, and cause mayhem for emergency vehicles even more ludicrous. And there's a petition there. So, you know, here's an intelligent woman grabbing hold of something that's got nothing to do with anything and using it as an excuse to say, we mustn't have a low traffic neighbourhood, which almost certainly wouldn't cause any mayhem for anybody, let alone emergency vehicles. And of course, in the thing is, we support the overarching objectives, reducing traffic, improving the environment. We stand ready to embrace change for the benefit of the wider community. However, you know, I'm a cyclist myself, blah, 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 blah. Now, in the backlash, you get stuff like this. This is from the cabbies, which poll on which person did more damage to London. And we've already had the Euston Road cycle lane, which I'll come to in a minute, saying this is causing more damage than the Luftwaffe. And Paul Gannon did a very nice, dignified tweet saying, excuse me, my mother was a nurse in the Blitz. This is offensive to the memory of people who were actually in the real Blitz. And I could say the same myself because my father was an emergency surgeon in the Blitz. And you do get these, I mean, you know, everything Will Norman says, one thing I'll say for him is he does have to put up with absolute idiotic shit, a lot of it from cabbies. Right, now I showed you this last week in Lewisham. It's a screenshot of a tweet which showed a number of vehicles just driving around the planter there onto the footway, going past. Now the good news has been fixed, but just let's have a look at the way it was reported on BBC. Cars, that's not drivers, cars, driverless cars, mount pavement in order to avoid blockade. Now, blockade is what you have with a siege. It's not what you have when you're putting in some filtered permeability. Note the wording, and but it was the cycle safety team went down there, and the council put a single bollard there, so that was sorted out. Greater Manchester, you'll be hearing from. Okay, here's London. Don't forget the story's a bit all over the place. Do read these LCC articles. I've mentioned them before. On TfL schemes, I was taken to task for being a bit too rude about what had happened last week. Hampstead Road lanes are protected to some extent, and there are extra lengths of protected lanes in roads leading to Hampstead Road. So Hampstead Road and surrounding schemes a bit better than I might have given the impression of. And also Euston Road, 660 metres is due to be installed, not just 200. And there's due to be one lane on each side now. Now that means going down from 6 lanes to 4. And this was yesterday. Here are wands or cylinders more like going in. This is eastbound, nice wide cycle lane. Got a rave review from Brenda Pesh. Something a bit, this is going this direction. Melton Street, which is the old entrance into Euston. There's, you know, this is a new livery for street space. It's being blocked off. I'm not quite sure why that is, but you have to come out of the lane, go there, and then, or else you can hop off the bike and go across. I'm not sure why it's like that. Yes, Park Lane, still a bit of a query. Not sure about entrance and exit to them. I'd like TfL to get on with trying to do something about Regent's Park. General TfL policy, Hammersmith Bridge reopening to motor traffic has been paused because of lack of finance. Silvertown Tunnel we're still complaining about. We haven't got smart road user charging on the agenda. We should have. We want to know more about having the quality of good quality cycle lanes so that you don't get left hooked. And what about whether there are no cycle lanes and extended footways? So there's still questions about the quality and monitoring required for the temporary infrastructure going in, which we'd like to see talked about. Okay, now, they're due to be 6 overall London allocations, a bit complicated mixing with stuff directly from the Department of Transport. It's taken from Laura Laker's articles and blogs. This is the link for each scheme in London. Go to each scheme, you can see there. Now, what I've noticed is a lot of this is going on school streets, which are good, great stuff, school streets, well done to the people there. But the bad councils who don't really want to reallocate road space seem to be using them as a way of getting funding. And I'm just a bit worried that there are these people who really need to be told off forcefully, who are saying, oh, well, okay, we'll have 3 or 4 schools out of their 30, 40, 50 that will get temporary road closure every day, a couple of times. And that's not really what we should be talking about. We need something more fundamental than that. Here's what's happened with the boroughs under what I think is the 5th of 6 allocations. There's still one more tranche of allocations, quite a big one, to come later this week. And that could be the game changer for London. A lot of stuff about don't say road closed at closures, say closed to motor vehicles, open for people, and various graphics. And there is this new graphic from TfL there, which is going on planters. Okay, Westminster reopening the hospitality sector in a big pedestrianisation plan, but it's only from 5 to 11 p.m. on weekdays, different hours at weekends. Greenwich have got 600k for a cycle route and 100k from DFT for up to 5 filtering schemes. It's good news. The DFT's allocations, there was only 50% for the bad guys, Havering, Bexley, Bromley, Kensington, Chelsea, Wandsworth and Westminster. Hounslow have said that some, at least, if not all of their bus lanes are going to be made 24/7. Wandsworth, weekend ban on motor traffic on Northcote Road. That's the photo they use. So a lot of stuff on having al fresco dining. Now, whoa, there was a really shocking video put out by this guy about some infrastructure in Kingston upon Thames. A bus stop done wrong, not a floating bus stop. A slightly weird junction there. Other junctions where cyclists don't have priority. It's bi-directional, so you get various problems. And one of them shows a conflict where a motorist is just not expecting someone to be coming from this direction. Plus, you only get onto it in a rather weird way. And there's a shared use path as well. So it's how not to do things. Not strictly related to the emergency active travel funding, but still relevant. Okay, now there's some good extra reading, which I suggest you look at. Transport Action Network still trying to raise money to fight their case. This is the article you should read from Professor Phil Goodwin. If you haven't read it already, absolutely essential. The Transport for New Homes report I mentioned last week, and the Oxfordshire Livable Streets video is useful. And we also have now a nice blog from Alex Ingram, who's should be somewhere in the background. Do have a look at that. That's just gone up. Also useful, I mentioned last week, BBC video on how to start cycling to work, webinars from Cycling UK. There's a petition gone in this week from Welsh healthcare workers saying COVID-19 is less bad than poor air quality and climate change, and calling for more support for active travel. Mentioned official government advice on doing traffic orders. The London Healthy Streets scorecard is out. This is pre the COVID measures. Some of it looks a bit weird. It gives an unnecessarily high rating to Haringey, who most of the activists I know think Haringey is pretty crap. But worthwhile looking at what people have been doing and how they're scored. but this was before the emergency measures. The RTPI report. This is from Lillian Greenwood MP. This is a very nice, simple, easily digested, non-radical point about supporting active travel, which you can give to your local councillors. It's very non-threatening and useful. Mentioned this from the LCC last week. Sustrans have got a guide to low traffic neighbourhoods. I haven't read it, but you may wish to. And also from Cycling UK, how can I get cash for temporary cycle lanes? Here's an interesting graphic from a guy called Rory Meakin, using the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government's official values. He calculates the value of land used for on-street residence parking in London as £48 billion, which drivers aren't having to pay for. So there's a useful set of figures there. And finally, here's a nice photograph of the Railton low traffic neighbourhood in London Borough of Lambeth. Apparently these markings are illegal. I don't know who did them, maybe guerrilla marking makers. That's it for today.
Whirlwind tour, very, very rough guide to monitoring. First thing I wanted to talk about, hopefully people can see my screen. It says it's sharing. Can I have a nod for something?
Yeah, you're good, Megan.
Brilliant. Okay, so first thing I wanted to talk about was thinking about who your audience is. You know, if you only have a certain amount of time in order to do your monitoring, who actually are you trying to reach with it? You're probably not trying to do a transport appraisal. You're looking in terms of influencing. So if it's councillors, you might be going for more of the stories approach. If it's council officers, it might be that actually you are trying to have some more robust data, or you're having another look at data they've already got. If it's the general public, maybe it's about challenging some assumptions. If it's business owners, you're looking at what are the things that they care about. There might be potential funders. If it's a community-based project that you're looking to maybe show the appetite for it. So lots of different audiences, but what are you trying to tell them? So a couple things you might be trying to get out of your monitoring. Either you're trying to prove that there's a problem that needs addressing, that you're showing either before or after that it's something that's popular, there's appetite for it from the public. This is particularly important if you are trying to influence councillors. You might be trying to show that either it's better than you thought people thought it would be, or just trying to show that the world hasn't ended. And knowing the difference between those two, I think is important about what it is that you're trying to get out of this. Or you might just be trying to show that your data isn't biased, that you have had a good look at this and you can show a mixture of responses. And that's the main thing that you're trying to do, is just show people that you're not there as a single issue group. So you also want to think about what's a reasonable amount of effort. So don't reinvent the wheel. A number of people told me this when I was asking for examples. Have a look at what data is there already. And then see what you can do either to look more carefully at some of that data, complement it, or plug gaps. Also a suggestion about how robust do you really need it? If you're trying to influence, it might be that you just want to show generally that there's appetite. You know, so it might be that you could get away with a smaller sample size, you can get away with doing something mostly via social media. It might be in some cases, if you're trying to feed into a report for a council decision or for a committee, maybe you actually need something a lot more robust and you want to mostly work on existing data sets. Whatever you do, if you're doing this in your own time, spend it wisely. Figure out really think about your audience and what you're trying to get across to them, and try to limit to what's going to work for that. You don't want to burn out other volunteers by asking them to do loads and loads of counts if actually that's not what's needed. So a couple examples from people. Cycle Dumfries have done 2 counts recently. So the first one, they looked at an urban setting, and there's a particular crossing that's really been bugging them. So what they wanted to do was influence in terms of physical distancing, how people were using it, that there was appetite for something different, that there were a number of people using it. So they specifically went out on weekends, because they know that's where the biggest issue is. And they did a really simple tally count. In addition to cyclists, they were also looking at numbers of pedestrians. They realized really quickly they couldn't also include cars. So they just focused on the stuff they knew they could do quickly and made sure that it had broad appeal. So in addition to how many people were using it, they did a rough breakdown of, I think, their subjective opinion on gender and rough age. They also looked in a rural setting. So for that one, the audience was more generally, I think, about public and councillors, and they wanted to capture the stories, the idea of who's actually using this. So one of the things they did, again, they were trying to look at what's the balance between sport and leisure. And they also talked to a few individuals. So they got, with permission, photos of this guy who's out on a ride as part of a prostate cancer recovery group. There were also a lovely photo of a young woman who was out for a long ride. And they're just trying to give the general public, give the councillors some of the idea of the range of people who were using it. Another example was in Bournemouth. So this was a group of residents as well as people from Bournemouth University looking at a high street. So the audience was mostly the businesses, and they did a perception survey of retailers. This is a bit of work that they did on existing data on who else, what other places were available for shopping. But then they also asked retailers, why did you choose to come there? Found out that actually most of them either lived locally or they liked it for the sense of footfall, the students who lived locally in that area. But when the retailers were asked, what do you want to see improved? Parking comes up really high. This idea of working with the clientele that you already have who are local seems to have disappeared. So there's a lot that this group probably could do in the next stages in terms of influencing businesses, really play up the sense of aesthetics, play up, maybe do a customer survey to find out where people are coming from, do some more work around that. Winchester, now if you want to go really in depth, and I'll link to this afterwards, WINAC have done some stunning work. It's incredibly time intensive. So one of the things that they did was a car park was closed, and they then said, okay, well, how's that stack up? Because of the audience was mostly for officers and for either committee members or cabinet members, it's a 15-page report. They spent a lot of time looking at the data. This is, again, kind of volunteer-led. And most of it was looking at existing data sets to find out what was the expected change in footfall based on people's assumptions about the car park and how shoppers were coming and what would happen, and then comparing it to actual footfall data. It's a very lengthy document, but they chose to use that time for that because of who the audience was and what story they wanted to get across. Just through in a last example before I ask Michael if he can share some of his tips. This one from Southampton, I grabbed this off of Twitter today. Now the audience generally to do the cycle counts that they're doing at the moment is for councillors. They're trying to show that there is a good number of cyclists who are using this route. And it is council-led, but they've asked the community to get involved. What I thought was interesting about this image shared on Twitter from one of the volunteers is by including a child and putting something on Twitter, it starts to change the audience. It's no longer just about creating a narrative in terms of the numbers. It's starting to widen that thing both to the public and to councillors to tell that story about who's using the infrastructure, who cares about it, who is it for. So I wanted to ask Michael, because he came to me on Twitter with a whole host of stuff that he got involved with. Michael, did you have anything that you wanted to add into that?
Yes, certainly. Perhaps I should explain, I live in the area where we have something called Vauxhall Gyratory, and TfL are planning to demolish what is the second largest bus station in London. And a number of people in the community got together a few years back, and we developed quite a lot of expertise and understanding. Can you hear me okay? All right. We even went as far as buying the same software that TfL use, something called Linsig, because if you want to take on TfL and the council, you've got to understand the information, understand what they are using to make their decisions. One of the things that led on to is to doing our own traffic movement counts, not traffic counts. Traffic counts are simply how many vehicles of a certain type pass a certain point. Traffic movements tell you how many are turning left, how many are turning right, how many going which direction. That's more important when you come to low traffic neighborhoods, to understand that. And by coincidence, because of all this work we did for Vauxhall, when the oval lower traffic neighborhood came along, we found ourselves with some good baseline information about rat running in the local area. So we knew how many cars and vehicles were going down various residential roads. Originally, we were looking to what the impact of demolishing the bus station was. And here we were sitting on a load of interesting data that was useful to the campaign to help the lower traffic neighborhoods. But we also did a number of other things. We also did impact on local businesses. So we did a survey on 2 local wards, all the different businesses and types. This has been going on for a number of years, about how many, what they were in 1 year, what they were a year later, and the number of shops started to close. I mean, just to give you, I'm generally supportive of lower traffic neighborhoods, but if I can give you a personal experience, I used to own a bookshop in the area back in the early 2000s. And whatever anybody might say, I was one of the businesses that was hit by congestion charge and Lambeth parking. And over the period of a couple of years, it cost me quite a lot of money. And a lot of local shops closed as a result of, or more correctly, not closed, got replaced. So my bookshop is now a dentist, very successful dentist. So sometimes I think it's, if I had a message for this group, I suppose it's 2 things. One is you have to produce information that supplements and helps the council come to the correct decision. So I'm very much neutral. I will tell the council exactly where the traffic has gone. You know, so it used to be useless in, it used to be heavy traffic here. Now, as a result of these changes, it's gone somewhere else. And I think it's, I've always been very neutral about being honest about the positive and negative. None of these low traffic neighborhood schemes are all black or white. Okay, and I've found it quite useful. So where there's a little bit of extra rat running, being displaced, to be honest about that. And in some cases, some of our local shops are being damaged. And as I say, we have no shortage of data. But if there's one thing I think that would make a low traffic neighborhood successful, and that is if a week before and a few weeks after they're introduced, is somebody stands at key locations and explains to drivers what they should be doing. They get such a bad press, and all the anger and frustration comes out in those first few weeks. And it's really simply because people don't know where to go. Okay, and you certainly I've stood there, but just by chance talking to drivers. That's what they get angry about. And I think these schemes would get a lot better press if somebody was there helping drivers to direct. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Right, that's us done.
So this is our prototype first Cyclops Junction. We picked this site on the Chorlton route, which is hopefully going to be furnished with a few of these, because there was actually a little bit of a larger footprint than you might get otherwise. So we thought it's a good place to see whether we could actually get this in comfortably and get everything to work from a pedestrian cycling perspective, you know, without having to compromise too much, and we could. So on this, you're seeing the main road is what's going left to right, east to west, side road north south. You can see the green is where the cycle tracks are, and the green around the outside, this sort of orbital cycle track that goes around the outside of the junction, is a fully protected route. So if you as a cyclist wish to use the entirely protected route and use the roundabout around the outside, all the signals will give you complete protection from traffic conflicts. This prototype design we put in also contains ASLs, which has been noted, I think, in social media, and in fact also gives the ability for cycle traffic on the main road to have a sort of standard near side position, which is obviously not favoured from a safety perspective, but actually there was a belief from Manchester that they might like to try this sort of more traditional method as well, to give cyclists the opportunity to either go ahead with traffic and take the risk regarding left and right hook, or use the orbital cycle track. So we've produced something here which sort of should cater for all cyclists, depending on their abilities. So again, green is the cycle track, red is the controlled crossings. It's different to what other places have done in the world, and obviously London have done in Waltham Forest, in that the cyclists you'd naturally assume would be on the inside, which is where they are relative to the traffic. Normally we've put them on the outside, and we feel that there are benefits in terms of spatial fit, particularly in terms of stacking space for cyclists, and the ability to do more complex junction arrangements inside the orbital cycle track. So I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, John, in terms of overview.
No, hi. Yeah, I've managed to get in. Sorry about that. I think we lost Dave, haven't we? Yeah, I think the key feature is the fact that the cycle routes are on the outside. They're external to the pedestrian routes, and at the classic crossroads like this is quite intuitive to see. But when you get to the more complex junctions, where you've got, you know, islands and signal arrangements within the orbital ring, it becomes more obvious how adaptable this prototype is to a lot more situations and scenarios. I don't know if you've got any of those lined up, Richard.
Yeah, do you want me to flick onto the sort of presentation now, and we can see a few different alternatives? I'll try and do that. 1 sec.
Yes, please.
Right, sorry, we're not very well prepared here. So this is something I did over in Berlin recently, presentation. I'm just going to flick through the sort of the initial stuff and get to some of the more complex arrangements. So there's the Royce Road prototype, which we've just seen in the flesh. There's Royce again. Sorry about this. So this one is a slightly skewed variation of Royce. It's actually essentially the same, but similar kind of scenario. Sorry, I should have done my homework here, really. That's the scenario where we can get a diagonal crossing. So you can see straight away, the benefit of the orbital cycle track is that you can do more complex things inside the junction. So this has got a diagonal crossing, which you won't be able to do if the cyclists were on the inside. So that's one sort of variation in terms of complexity. This is the Bolton job that's being switched on, hopefully within the next few months. It's being built as we speak, and this definitely has a more complex internal arrangement. So cycle track, you see, go all the way around the outside. That's the key feature. The Cyclops goes all the way externally, and it's actually quite a skewed crossroads, this, where there's the side arms run separately. And in terms of getting this to work from a business case and traffic capacity perspective, we needed to minimize the impact that the pedestrian phases had on the junction, and hence we required these triangular islands, staggered islands, and whatever else for walkway traffic pedestrians, but we still managed to get the cyclists around the outside. So again, that's the sort of key feature there. Because the cyclists have shorter intergreens compared to pedestrians, because they're moving faster, we can allow for the cyclists going across in one entire movement. So from one side of the carriageway to another, we can cater for those in terms of timings, where we won't be able to do that with pedestrians. So where in terms of junction efficiency, we might have to stagger pedestrians. With cyclists, we can go straight away over in one hit because their intergreens don't have to be quite as onerous as a pedestrians. Anything
Yeah, I
to
think
add to that?
it's worth saying there that that's a key feature, isn't it? So with the external orbital ring, the cycle movements are always attempting to be made in one movement. There won't be any staggered cycle facilities, where the PEDs will quite often have staggered arrangements as you would have in a traditional junction, which is walk with traffic. And in a lot of the cases, like the left turn you can see directly in front of you, that will effectively be a hold the left, which will enable the cycle track to go in one movement across the main road.
Yeah, so we've now produced. Well, we've certainly got on the drawing board 30 or 40 of these at different levels of completion. So when we started off with Royce Road as a bit of a concept that we were interested to see would get any legs, we soon realised that actually it was a fairly adaptable template. Now, if you've got a very tight junction with buildings, close and not much in the way of a footprint, which you might have in some of the sort of market towns. Obviously, these things aren't going to be achievable, but there's a surprising number where there is enough room to fit this in relatively comfortably. And even if you end up with footway widths at sort of 1.8 to 2 meters at the back, in terms of the feel, in terms of urban realm, you actually get quite a lot more because you've reclaimed a lot of carriageway space from the general traffic, and the feel you get, because when you've got pedestrians, cyclists, and then pedestrian islands, you feel as though you're a long way from the traffic, and actually a 2 meter footway or a 1.8 meter footway outside of the cyclist feels quite comfortable compared to how it would do adjacent to a traffic lane. So it really feels as though it's quite comfortable. When we've been out on site on Royce Road, which has recently switched on, you definitely don't feel as though the pedestrians have been hard done by at all, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a key feature that you're always trying to achieve a footpath at the back. So you're only crossing onto an island if you also need to use a signal control crossing is the ideal scenario. So, if you're going left as a cyclist or a pedestrian, you're actually avoiding all signal control. So the islands are there for people who are attempting to make a crossing. Yeah. Have you got the next example, Richard?
You're muted.
Richard, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I've just been talking to myself. I do this all the time, so apologies. This, in the north end of the picture here, this is where the previous junction I've shown is Newport Street in Bolton. This is a Cyclops just to the east of it, so just down the road. And actually what we've been producing, or we're in the process of producing, is a master plan for Bolton Town Centre, where we've got a number of these Cyclops. So from a pedestrian and cyclist and general traffic perspective, you're going to be encountering a similar kind of concept and layout in the locality of Bolton Station, and I think people should get quite used to this concept that we can see here. So again, the key feature of the cyclists going around the outside of the pedestrians can be seen here, and a slight variation on the theme is that it's difficult to pick out here, but there's a dedicated left turn which is sort of outside of the cycle gyratory, but it's a very, very heavy left turn. So we've ended up with a kind of pedestrian cycle stage which is divorced from a very heavy left turn, and we've managed to sort of show it's like variation on that Cyclops theme again here. So as we're saying, there are adaptable elements to it, and you can have different variations on the theme, and we think it's something that's fairly intuitive and transferable. Not sure there's any other images after this. I'll just have a quick look. No, I think that's probably the end.
While you're there, I've just been looking at the questions that are coming through. We've got a professor on the line who'd quite like you to talk through the staging on the Royce Junction. particularly the funkier elements that you're doing with how cyclists are detected. Is that okay?
Yeah, no worries. I'll bring up an image of Royce then from the top. This might be best because it's indicative rather than, you know, this is the original sort of CAD drawing that it was based on. So I'm just seeing it. Have we got the chat up that I can read there? Is there any specific questions, Brian? Sorry. Was it about the staging specifically?
Yeah, if you could just run through how it operates, who goes where, who does what, and particularly some of the detection stuff that's going in there.
Right, yeah, okay, no worries. Okay, so in this one here, in the Royce Road example, we've got a 3-stage junction. So it's hopefully as simple as some of these Cyclops will get. So east and west would be traffic, the 2 traffic phases in one stage. Let's call that stage 1, east and west on the main road. Stage 2 is the pedestrian stroke cycle stage. So the cyclists and pedestrians all get a green in the same stage. So the controlled pedestrian facilities on the inside of the ring and the controlled cycle facilities on the outside, which are dedicated red, amber, green full traffic signals for cyclists. So they all run in the same stage. Let's call that stage 2. And then finally, stage 3 would be the side road, what appears to be north and south from this image. Because it's a gyratory roundabout for cyclists, if you approach as a cyclist from where my mouse is here on the west side, you would give way to any cyclist on the roundabout, and that means you're bypassing that signal. So from a cycling perspective, to access the cycle ring, you don't have to, you're not under signal control. So you can come through here and join the cycle gyratory at any point, irrespective of signal control. So you just give way to the right as you would a roundabout. In this scenario, we've got a zebra, but it could equally be uncontrolled, I think, as is per the Royce Road on site at the moment. And then you've got cycle signals, which run at the same time as the pedestrian signals in stage 2, as I've described. So that's the fundamental rationale. If you're doing a left turn from a cycling perspective, you have to give way to cyclists from your right and pedestrians, but then you can carry on your way and you wouldn't be delayed at all if there's no one there to give way to. So it's very good for left turning cyclists. If you're turning right or ahead, you'll have to go through this signal here. And obviously, if you're doing a right, you'd go through the other signal. And in terms of green times, because the pedestrians and their associated intergreens are relatively long compared to cyclists, what we found is that when the cyclists get to green in stage 2, they've got plenty of time to make 2 phases and do a right turn. And actually, it appears on this junction, if you're traveling at a reasonable-ish speed, you can quite easily do the full U-turn, or in fact, the full loop. So there's plenty of time to make all movements. You're definitely not having to make turns in 2 stages, and that's essentially the essence to it, I think. I can probably bring up a slide further forward, actually, which has got that staging shown for the similar Brooks Bar junction just down the road. So there we go. This is a bit more graphical here. So you've got stage 1, traffic north and south. Stage 2, traffic east and west, for example. And stage 3, this is when all of the pedestrian and cycle facilities get to green at the same time. But like I said, from a cycle perspective, it's also a roundabout with priority elements to it. So you're signal controlled at the conflict with the road, and you're giving way to other cyclists on the gyratory, or you're giving way to pedestrians at the pedestrian crossing. Any specific questions on those elements? Or John, have you got anything to add to that?
Can you talk about the detection? Because a lot of people have been asking about, do you need to push the button and how it works on the detection?
That's something that, apologies, Brian, yeah, I forgot about that. So that was something that came up on Twitter. Let me see if I can bring up the Royce Road junction again in the drone image. Right. So detection wise, we've got push buttons at the stop lines, which I know everybody's not so keen on, but they are as much as anything for backup purposes. So we've definitely got a pedestrian push button, a push button, sorry, for cyclists at the stop line itself. We are intending to install piezo loops, which detect cyclists on the approach, predominantly for the main road. So we were less concerned about the side road because this is a heavy cycle route in and out of Manchester, with cyclists definitely coming from the side roads, but not to the same numbers. Now, on the main road, we intend to place the piezo loops about 20 or 30 metres back, approximately where I've got my cursor now, around where that cycle symbol is, and that'll put in an advanced demand for this cycle phase here, which in turn actually demands the entire cycle and pedestrian stage. So if the pedestrian cycle stage comes in, all of the phases constituent to that stage will appear. So if one cyclist demands this phase via the piezo loop, for example, the whole lot will come in anyway, which obviously benefits anybody else arriving on different arms that may not have activated a loop or pressed a button. So that is the intention, which hopefully we're going to get installed in the next few weeks. We're a little bit behind on that, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is worth saying that's not installed yet, is it? So
no, it's not
at the Royce Junction, that's currently not operating. So that in the future, that will be an advanced demand and extension for cycle phases.
That's right. That's right. Now, in terms of installing them upstream of the gyratory, you've kind of got to think about where the cyclists are likely to go. Now, we assume that majority of cyclists on the main road who are heading towards the junction will actually need to be going ahead, and therefore putting a demand for the stage won't be wasted, i.e. if they're turning left, that would, put in a stage demand that wasn't needed. So that's why we can justify piezo loops on the main road, and on the side road would be more difficult to justify because there was a fairly high chance that a cyclist could be turning left, and we didn't really want to be demanding the stage unnecessarily and causing motorists to complain about the stage appearing without any traffic. Now, that said, what we have done here is, in the absence of vehicular demands or extensions, we have actually got this to revert to the ped and cycle stage. Now, we wouldn't traditionally have reverted to a pedestrian stage, but given that this has got 4 cycle phases as well as 4 pedestrian phases, we actually thought it was fairly reasonable to have in the quiescent state, in less trafficked states, the ability to revert to the ped and cycle stage. So when the traffic disappears and there's no more loop activity, it will actually go to the pedestrian cycle stage, which is beneficial to any cyclists who are on approach at that time. So there are ways to ramp up cycle and pedestrian kind of bias, which is what we intend to do with the loops, which is what we've done with the reversion to the ped cycle stage. And going forward, if traffic volumes continue to stay relatively low and cycle and pedestrian volumes go up, there's obviously always the opportunity to bring in this cycle stage more frequently than once a cycle. So you could go main road cycle peds, side road cycle peds in a future scenario. So there's things to do to further increase the overall green time slice that the cyclists and pedestrians are getting. Anything to add to that, John?
No, I think that's an important point, isn't it? If the more cyclists that use it, the more cyclists that turn up, the loops will be used to extend the green time or bring the stage in more often. So that if you look at the kind of cycle numbers you get in London, the more cyclists are there, the longer the green time will run. I mean, I think there's a hope in the future also to put it on Cycle Mover as well.
Yeah, there was some of the comments here. I think Sam Tate's mentioned that there's more you could do with detection, and there certainly is. And there'd be, potentially you could put in advanced demands on all approaches and cancel them down if cyclists have turned left. Now, if that needs to happen in the future, that's a possibility. It's not something we envisage that would be urgently required, but the geometry that we've got there, save a bit of extra infrastructure for loops and overhead detection or whatever else, has given us a good starting point to get fairly good coverage for cyclists and peds and a fairly good service for them. And obviously that can be increased in the future if we get big increases in cycle flows.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question for chaps. It's the big one for everybody who wants to buy one of these. How much did that junction cost?
I think it's worth saying. I think it's worth saying that the road was in a bad state, and they've resurfaced quite an extensive area of the whole road. So, do you know, Richard?
It wasn't horrendous. I mean, what you can see there is that you've got a lot more curbing than you would at a traditional junction. You've probably got at least 2.5, 3 times as much curbing. You know, complete new curbing and new civils associated with that. Now, we didn't do any service diversion, utility diversions at this junction. That's one of the things we try and actively avoid, because we know that's a real big cost headache. So if you hit a BT chamber and it's an important one full of fibre optics, you can double the cost of the scheme, can't you? So that's something we always try to avoid. We actively look for utilities beforehand. We actively look for utilities covers, and the junction geometry can be melded to some degree to mitigate that. So you can move your cycle track and your pedestrian island slightly to avoid boxes, which is what we've done here. So I think in the grand scheme of things, it was probably in the region of $500,000 or so,
Yeah.
John.
It's also the fact that generally, if you've got a cycle lane on the carriageway, an existing cycle lane on the carriageway, you're generally building the curb out at least to that cycle lane. So there's not any actual widening of the carriageway. You're effectively building the curb out into where the existing cycle lane is. So you don't normally get the stats diversions. It's just generally trying to get the actual cycle track itself to avoid BT or any kind of services that are actually in the footway, but you're generally trying to reduce the carriageway footprint by building out for the cycle track. So there's not usually a lot of widening involved. It's avoiding services in the footway with the actual cycle track itself.
And there's more that can be done with that in mind. You don't have to drop your cycle track to 125 mil or 65 or 75 mil or whatever you decided upon. If there's local issues that you really are trying to avoid in terms of utility boxes, then you could ramp up to flush, for example. So there are ways and means to avoid the impacts of utilities. And actually, because like as John says, we're reclaiming carriageway and we're turning things either into footway or cycle track, that's actually not as bad from a utility perspective as extending the carriageway out wider, which means everything tends to drop down further, and you've got bigger. You've got to have a larger construction for the carriageway surface rather than the footway or cycle track. So it's not generally not been too bad from a utilities perspective, which keeps the cost down.
Yeah, it's the fact you're actually building 3 curb lines, aren't you? You're building the inside and outside of the cycle track and an outside curb line for vehicular traffic. So that's where the additional cost really is. There's a little bit more traffic signal equipment. There's a few more poles because you've got dedicated poles for the cycle phases, which we try to minimise by having the push button units on the same pole as a low level cycle. But I think it's not usually the stats. It's usually the fact you're effectively building 3 curb lines, which you would do for any segregated cycle track.
Just looking at some of the comments that are coming through, I think someone might have referenced the curvy bit here and what was the purpose of that, and it all sort of ties in with this cycle track that's behind the parking. So this scheme was trying to upset as few people as possible, so we've kept this floating parking here. As I mentioned before, the cyclist had an option to either go straight on the main road and take the risk with the left-right hook, or go around the cycle track. So this curve here gives the ability to have a bit more of a plan to urban realm, and it sets cyclists up to take the choice and decision about whether they're going straight on or to join the gyratory. And you can see actually there's a very wide bit of green there. So if you're vulnerable, you're not going to feel too uncomfortable about coming a bit closer to traffic here than to go round the gyratory. But that's the purpose of the curves. In addition,
I was going to say, it also, as you approach, the curving in kind of reinforces the one-way system. So you're turning them away. So you naturally get an island which has enough space to get your traffic signal pole for general traffic and turn cyclists towards the route they're going to be to reinforce the one-way system.
Yeah, so these little islands are quite an noteworthy element here, because if you count them up, you've ended up with quite a few islands. But importantly, you've got a primary, near side primary signal here, which is for the general traffic. So if you're coming along from a general traffic perspective, this stop line, that's the associated signal for it. The fact that the cyclists are going around the outside means they can bypass it. And then this additional island here is our near side primary for the cyclists, again allowing cyclists who are going to the left of it to bypass it and not be under signal control. So if you're doing a left, you're never under signal control, only if you're going ahead or right. So that's the purpose of these extra auxiliary islands, and that's one of the more difficult things to fit in, I'd say, in terms of swept path of vehicles making turns. It's always a bit more difficult because we've got to allow for this primary signal, stop line, and the ability for the cyclists to go around it. But with a bit of careful sort of design, it can be achieved on a lot of junction footprints. Just have a look at the other comments.
All right, is that everybody's questions?
I've got one.
I've got one.
Yeah, okay, let's come in with the questions. I think me and Phil are going to talk about cycle streets next week, so we'll just we'll round it up by continuing the questions for the guys. So so come in and ask away.
Okay, can I just one sort of detail on the?
Was it Graham I heard?
It's Graham, yeah, it's Bolton. I noticed that they're all vertical curbs being used rather than chamfered or splayed ones. Is there a reason for that?
It was MCC's specific detail in terms of the construction. No, I would have said that the choice is down to the authority, what they go for. I can understand the benefit of using splayed curbs or something that's a bit more forgiving. Likewise, rather than go for the full 125 depth on the curb face, which might be a bit difficult for pedals, you could go for 65mm, which I believe is tolerable from a visually impaired perspective, to give them sufficient feel of depth, but also they're not interact with the cycle pedals. So there are different options. What we've used are British standard half battered curbs, and that gives us a very good palette of materials. So we can use 0.6 internal, external radii, 1 meter, 2, 4, 6, 8. You've got a lot of options there, and that's the benefit of BS curbs on something that's quite complex. That said, it can be done in conservation curbs or anything else. So it's just a case of using the materials that are appropriate. We wanted to stay, well, MCC wanted to stay relatively straightforward on this as a starting point, and then you can do variations beyond that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the Junction has a lot of different radii curbs on it, doesn't it? And maximising the number of different radius you can have for the different scenarios is kind of vital to being able to fit it in, because there are a lot of changes in radii on these small islands in quite small areas, especially close to the pedestrian areas where you need transition curbs, which are very restrictive. So
yeah, sorry, John. Yeah, this one's quite illustrative in some of the different examples. So there are you can use taper curbs in the areas surrounding ped crossings, where you go from full height down to 0. We decided to elect for sort of mini islands, which really pen pedestrians in and give them a feel of protection, and mean that they're more likely to find a crossing. So you can see all of these islands are sort of bounded by mini islands, as it were. So pedestrians coming in from all 3 sides of this triangular island are well and truly penned in by high curbs, and that was something that we got advice to go down that route to start with. But you can use normal taper dropper curbs alternatively.
Hi, Colin Ryder here from Dublin. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello, how you doing?
Thanks very much for. It's the first time actually I dropped in on it. Look, it's good to get this in, because we've been discussing here in Dublin around the difference between the Dutch and the Cyclops approach. So it's good to get that kind of in detail thing. Can I just ask a couple of questions here? One is just in relation to if I heard you rightly, there is an all ped and cycling green on this as well as in this particular junction.
Yeah,
Yes, that's right.
it's a full ped stage and
Yeah.
full ped and cycle stage. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering why there isn't a cross, a diagonal, option for pedestrians on it. That's the first, just the first question. The second one is just oh, sorry, go ahead.
Carry on.
The second one is just about the actual crossings for pedestrians over the cycle tracks. We have an issue here with disability groups and complaining about, they're looking for push button crossings of cycle tracks all the time, that they're saying they're not safe enough for people who are nearsighted or unsighted, and that's the main thing with disability groups. Do you have the same issue there? Has it been raised by disability groups there in the UK?
John, do you want to answer this one? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think Richard, myself, and Brian did a presentation to the DDRG group in Manchester. When pedestrians, cyclists, and traffic are getting their own dedicated space, so at some point they've got to cross each other to access crossings. The option is to have a controlled crossing, to have a mini zebra, or to have, in this scenario, they've actually installed an uncontrolled crossing. I think if you consider, if you had to put a controlled crossing in every scenario as you went down a route, there will always be instances where you have to cross, pedestrians have to cross a cycle track, and it's not possible to always signalise that crossing. So it just becomes a question of what is the most appropriate form in that location. I think initially, in all the concept, we had mini zebras here. The geometry is actually designed with the turning movements to slow cyclists down on the approach to these crossings. Manchester elected to go for uncontrolled crossings in this scenario. It's obviously a difficult issue that you're going to come up against.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of timings, if we were to control those with red, amber, green signals, we thought it was a little overkill because you'd end up having a kind of 5-second intergreen from the traffic cycle phase to the pedestrians. Then we have to run a min green for those. It all becomes a very complex. It's obviously a lot of infrastructure to install. We thought that the compliance wouldn't be particularly good. So our preference is really zebras. So when we've got cycle track crossings for pedestrians, we prefer just to use geometry to kind of highlight the presence of and the location, keep the crossing relatively narrow, and we hope that pedestrians and cyclists will be able to sort it out for themselves. And if there's a zebra there, obviously there's some priority to pedestrians. So this is the route we've gone down, because we thought the infrastructure would be very onerous if we were to, signalise every crossing of the cycle track. Now, if you've got very, very high cycle flows, and there'll be certainly places like this in London, then it might be justifiable. But we think on most of the GM roads at the moment, the cycle flows are relatively low, and finding gaps in the cycle traffic should be relatively straightforward, and the interaction between pedestrians and cyclists should in theory be straightforward.
Yeah, thanks for that. But just to my question about, do you have any difficulties with disability groups complaining about this?
We have had an interaction. We've had some specific queries on Oxford Road about what went in near the eye hospital there, and the cycle flows are a bit higher on Oxford Road. So we've certainly had a bit of pushback from these groups, and for good reason, because cyclists, the interaction with pedestrians is not always entirely as you'd like. So it is problematic, but we've done what we can to mitigate that here.
I think I was going to say on Oxford Road, a lot of the crossings of the cycle track are on along straight sections for cycling, and it becomes a little bit more problematic then when the cyclists have got up a bit of speed. And I think with the geometry at a junction where you could naturally slow the cyclists who are making turning movements, you can really help the interaction.
Yeah, no, we can see that, all right. And just on the diagonal crossings, pedestrian crossings, any?
Yeah, so the reason we didn't go for it on this one, the diagonals, although they are possible, they take quite a lot of space in terms of we need islands to separate all of the controlled crossings. So if I take the what appears to be the north west corner here, for example, imagine we were to put a ped crossing diagonally from northwest to southeast across there, you'd have to make sure you've got separation between the pedestrian crossing that goes north-south, the pedestrian crossing that goes east-west, and the diagonal, which means practically another mini island or some way of differentiating the different tactile paving areas so it's legible and understandable. You'd have to have extra signal poles in for that. One of the big issues is the ped crossing by Pythagoras is going to be, 1.4 odd times the length of the ones across the main road and the side roads.
Yeah.
That means a big intergreen increase, and we already know that the limiting factor of these junctions is the length of the ped crossings rather than the cycle crossings. So I think on a skewed junction where it's not a square as what we're seeing here, diagonals are more achievable. If you've got plenty of capacity and plenty of space, then obviously you could, but we thought on this one that this is probably a good starting point, and diagonals are something that should be used in a fairly bespoke and specific environment, I would suggest.
Yeah, and I just wondering on the observance. I know it's fairly recently open, but observance of any kind of funny manoeuvres by pedestrians in that situation, as there been or crossing diagonally manoeuvres. Any observance?
Yeah, I don't think it doesn't lend itself to making diagonal manoeuvres because of the little islands that are in here. I think pedestrian behaviour tended to follow the routes that are prescribed at the moment. We've not done enough monitoring to see exactly what happens, but if you've got a very big desire to cross diagonally, then you should really take that into account, and you may wish to take the capacity hit associated with it if you've got a big diagonal movement, but it can be catered for.
Yeah. Okay. Look. Thanks for that. Okay, that's good. Thanks very much.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a quick one, if that's okay. John Parkin, I'm just looking at the exits from the junction. You seem to have some different arrangements for the merge. On the right-hand side, for example, you've got a give way. On the left-hand side, on the main road, you've got a sort of, I'm not quite sure exactly what it would be, but we've got two lanes separated there. Well, are you testing different scenarios to see what works, or what's going on there?
Yeah, so what you're highlighting here is the difference in particular between this one and which is on the southwest of the screen and the one on the northeast. Now we went, it was a bit of a collaborative working, so it's not just a design that came from the TFGM UTC, it's Manchester City Council as well, and they were keen to test different scenarios. So I think we probably initially decided that we show the same on both sides, but I think they wanted to, given the different geometry that was being tested out in terms of the islands, they wanted to test the two different scenarios. Both are reasonable, and I think they're kind of intuitive. Essentially, you're having to give way when you come off the circulatory on the northeast side to anybody who happens to be on the main road. And the alternative on the southwest side is the cyclists who are coming off the gyratory actually have right of way, and cyclists from the main road would be merging in. So two different options for testing, and we can get some feedback and see how they've panned out.
Just a very quick follow on, and the north-south then, I can't quite see how somebody who might choose to go across the junction on the carriageway gets back into the cycleway once they've crossed the carriageway, but that might be just clearer off the image that I can see, I don't know.
Yeah, so you can't see the whole lot here, but the segregation is actually really only for the main road, which is appears to be east-west here. North-south, the side roads are a bit narrower, so there isn't actually any physical segregation on the approaching cycle lanes on the side road. So if you did wish to go and keeping the traffic lanes going north-south, there's no dedicated cycle lane through the junction, so you'd have to take the dominant primary position as a cyclist and just go ahead, say southbound as I'm showing here, and then filter back into the advisory cycle lane. So a narrower overall footprint on a side road means no segregation, less traffic, more of a kind of suburban feel to it.
Thank you very much, and very well done, guys. Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Just got a quick question. So if you've got any private land boundary like constraints on the corners, in this one it seems like it's quite forgiving, like you've got quite a nice curve on each corner. What scope have you got for sort of reducing the junction size in terms of lane width, taking lanes out, reducing pedestrian area, or even reducing the cycle, like the on-road cycle lane?
Yeah, there are different options. Salford have been progressing with some different options where space has been constrained, where rather than have the ideal pedestrian route around the back, so if you're turning, let me say, from the south to the west, from a pedestrian perspective, if you're going left around the outside of the junction, you wouldn't expect to have to cross the cycle track. Whereas if you've got very little space, you can actually take the cycle track right away to the back of the building line, let's say, with a small offset, and force pedestrians to cross onto an island and then back off it if they're turning left from, say, south to west. So that's one way of dealing with not as much space. We have tended to design cycle tracks as a minimum of 1.65 metres wide, which enables you to go down to about a 4 metre internal radius, which can still be swept with the mini street sweepers. If you achieve longer than a 15 metre internal radius, which is a fairly long curve in cycle manoeuvrability terms, then you can go down to 1.5 metres. So there are ways of manipulating the geometry to go through straights or long radii, which can enable you to go down to, say, 1.5 metres. There's definitely ways of being more economical with space, and we've had to show that on less forgiving junctions. So there are means to do this.
Yeah, we've got quite a few examples of really quite small Cyclops on single lane approaches on every arm, where you don't have the luxury of always having a footpath around the back. So I mean, we can certainly give some further examples of that. I mean, this junction really is the ideal scenario where you do have a footpath at the back on each corner. You do have enough capacity to put a full ped stage in, the full cycle stage in. It's a really good example of the first one that could be done like this. We've got over 30 more Cyclops junctions we've designed, and there are some really quite small ones on quite small footprints, which we can share with people if they inquire.
All right, I might start winding it up now, because we've subjected you to enough. But I'm going to turn my video on for one last go, so I can just do my round of applause to Richard and Jonathan for, I think, doing one of the best junctions ever in the UK. It's stunning, and I'm really excited to see all the other ones coming through. That's my round of applause there. So we might wind it up a little bit now, and I'll see you next week when I'll have a more stable connection and you can see my face. I'll even have a shave and not be in my beach gear. How about that, even though it's been raining all day? But big thanks, chaps, and thanks to the other speakers as well. Should we call it a day there, unless anybody's got anything super vital at the last second? No, we're all...
Who invented it? Whose idea was it?
There's an interesting one. Well, those two guys there, as far as I'm concerned, Richard and Jonathan, they're the inventors.
And Dave as well. So to be fair, we a collaborative partnership, wasn't it, between me, Dave, John, and Brian when he joined as well, gave added impetus and political clout to it. So I think we've all been part of the process, and it's definitely not something that just suddenly appeared in someone's head. It took a long time to come to the what we've seen here in that adaptable template.
Yeah, I mean the key was putting the cyclist on the outside of the peds, which from a signal staging perspective gave us a lot more opportunities to always run the cycles with the peds, and a lot more opportunities to, not just in the classic crossroads of the full ped stage, but in lots of other scenarios, to have complex junction arrangements and signal staging within the external orbital ring. So yeah, it was definitely a long process to develop it.
Yeah, and I'll just give a shout out to Dave Stevens. I'm not sure what happened. He came in and ruined Bob's thing, and then jumped off again.
Well, Dave
a lot of people are asking
Yeah, Dave had the presentation, so we've had to wing it a bit. So.
Yeah, and Dave's a real character as well. It's absolutely
Yeah,
true. He's a good person to approach for further detail if you can't get hold of us three. I think a few people have been asking about that. And there's also the technical note on the TFGM website written by the four of us to help out. So hopefully we can do a bit more. And John Parkin, Professor's already said he's putting it in his next book. So fame at last. Well done, everybody.